Welcome back. You're watching To The Point. Sushma Swaraj's visit to Beijing began on Saturday amidst apprehensions that India's relations with China could become a little troublesome after the successful Obama visit and the shared vision statement. However, it seems that may not be the case. The first signs actually indicate India and China could be poised for a significant breakthrough. Or are we taking the rhetoric we hear from politicians a little bit more seriously than we should? My guests are two of India's former ambassadors to China, Nalin Suri and Chandrasekhar Das Gupta, the foreign editor of the Hindustan Times, Pramit Pal Chaudhary, and the India Today Group's China correspondent, Anant Krishnan. Mr. Suri, there were apprehensions that the Obama visit and the joint vision statement could have upset the Chinese. Do you today get the feeling that's not the case? Or are we taking what we hear from politicians a little bit more seriously than we should?
Actually, I never had that apprehension. A lot of it was created by analysts and the media, I think, to a large extent. If you look at the decisions taken when Xi Jinping was here, there's a very strong emphasis on collaboration in the Asia-Pacific. And if you look at the trilateral meeting which took place today in Beijing between the foreign ministers of India, China and Russia, you'll find they've also agreed to have a consultative mechanism on the Asia-Pacific. I think what is happening really is that every player is trying to negotiate with others to put itself in a position from which it can benefit. So we have many balls in the air. The question is, are we going to be able to handle those balls properly or not?
Mr. Das Gupta, you've heard Mr. Suri say that analysts being analysts began to speculate about the possible impact on India-China relations as a result of the Obama visit and that shared vision statement. Now, Sushma Swaraj has told Indian journalists in Beijing that Wang Yi, her Chinese counterpart, did not bring up the joint vision statement or the issue of India's growing closeness to the United States. So would you agree with Mr. Suri that analysts overdid it?
Absolutely. I agree with Nalin entirely on this. Actually, there was a Sinha commentary, a signed commentary on the 26th January, which said that there's no reason to expect that the improvement in India-US relations will adversely affect Sino-Indian relations. I think the Chinese understand fully well that India has a multi-directional foreign policy. We seek to improve, to carry forward our relations with every major power center.
Okay. Pramit Pal Chaudhary, let me push this a little further. Could it be the case that because India and the United States have visibly come closer, Beijing is now that much more determined to push its own relationship with Delhi further and further down the road?
I think that's definitely a school of thinking within the Indian government. There's always been, I would argue, two broad schools. One that argues that we need to walk carefully, if you wish, between the US and China on certain issues. And another one that argues actually when we tilt to America, at least symbolically and on certain issues, the Chinese tend to treat us with a little bit more respect. And I think insofar as Modi seems to be of the view that the second school actually makes sense to him. But I also add that there's a Modi twist to this, which is that Modi's real game, I think, is that he looks at the Chinese leadership, which is about as hard-nosed as you can get in the international system. And they are ultimately not less concerned about rhetoric than they are about what you do on the ground.
Sure.
They look at South China Sea and they say, what can India actually do there? The answer is nothing. Physically, this is not a power that has the ability to extend itself. But what he does offer them, and this is what I think excites them more, is that he says, I want to solve the border I want to solve the border dispute. I want to open the Indian economy to you. I want to do things which Indian leaders in the past have not been.
Clearly messages that have gone out during this visit. Is certainly messages that have been picked up, and I'll come to that in a fairly substantial way in a moment's time. But first, Anant, let's come to one other aspect that could be called an outcome of this visit. You're there in Beijing as it happens around you. It's been announced yesterday that the Prime Minister will visit China before May the 26th, although the precise date is still not known. Is it usual for this sort of announcement to happen as much as possibly 5 months in advance? Or is there once again an indication being given that nothing has gone wrong, the Obama visit hasn't affected it, and we're determined to push as fast as we can?
I think, Karan, was actually a little strange how the dates were announced. I think an official speaking to journalists said that the visit will take place in May, though I personally believe that it wasn't planned to announce this visit, and it just came out yesterday. But having said that, it has been interesting to see the talks that took place both yesterday and today. And I think I'd agree with what the previous person just said. I think there were snap judgments after President Obama's visit to India. And I think as far as China is concerned, in fact, I was just talking to Foreign Minister Wang Yi yesterday, and he said I think too much was made in terms of what we thought were Chinese anxieties about the Obama visit. And he said, well, I see you have close relations with the US. Well, China has close relations with the US too. So I think probably a little too much has been made of the visit last week.
Okay, let's come to this question of the border and what we are hearing from our foreign minister in particular. She said that both sides have the political will to think out of the box to find a solution to the boundary issue. And according to the Hindustan Times, she even said she was hopeful of a solution. And she added, this problem should not be left as a legacy for future generations. What does all of that suggest to you?
Well, I don't know what out of the box means, to be very honest. The fact is we have agreed parameters and guiding principles to solve the border issue. They are in the public domain. There's nothing secret about them. They were signed when Prime Minister Wen Jiabao came to India in April 2005. And since then, the effort has been to progress on part 2 of the whole special representative's progress, which is to see how you can actually find a solution to the border.
Except that progress was happening tardily and slowly at best.
It wasn't happening tardily and slowly. It's a very complicated and complex process. And I think part of the reason why it was even more complex and complicated was that, now I'm putting myself on the line here, but you know, I think the Chinese are happier dealing with the BJP on this issue than they were with the Congress.
Why is that?
I think for a variety of historical reasons. They also feel that, and you know, this is an impression which I think even our Pakistani colleagues have, that you know, you can actually do more business with the BJP than you can with the Congress. Now, don't ask me why, but I mean, I could answer the question, but I'd rather not in the public domain.
I leave you that prerogative not to spell out why, but simply leave us with that bold statement. But let me come back to this question, Mr. Das Gupta, of an out-of-the-box solution, because it jumped out and hit me when I read it in the papers this morning, and I'm sure it's attracted similar attention from a lot of others. Do we have any idea what an out-of-the-box solution could be? Or at this stage, is it impossible to say?
Well, I personally, I'm foxed by this concept. I do not know what precisely the foreign minister has in mind. I'm sure she has some original ideas, but I'm not sure what they are. Now, I think it's very important to see what Wang Yi said. And I'll read out what the Xinhua report is. According to Xinhua, Wang Yi said China is willing to make joint efforts with India to promote the process of negotiations on the border issues so as to maintain peace and tranquility in border areas. The way I read the statement is that the emphasis is on negotiations which will help to stabilize conditions, to stabilize, to ensure harmony, peace and tranquility in the border areas.
Absolutely.
Confidence-building measures, measures to ensure that border incidents don't take place, etc.
Let me pick up on...
that certainly is a very important and urgent requirement.
Another question. You've just heard what Xinhua says that their foreign minister said, and what he said doesn't sound extraordinary at all. It sounds like what one would expect him to say. Yet what Sushma Swaraj said when she talked about having the political will for an out-of-the-box solution was not just startling and new, it was for some very surprising. Did anyone in China, when she was speaking to all of you, ask her, what do you mean by out of the box?
Well, Karan, I think actually there was a little bit of confused reporting about this because Swaraj didn't say that she expected an out-of-the-box solution. What she meant was that at this point in time, we have two strong leaders in China and India, and we have two leaders who are capable of out-of-the-box thinking. So I think it's a bit of a leap to say that she was expecting an out-of-the-box solution. And I think the most important factor is we actually haven't had a meeting of the special representatives after India appointed Ajit Doval as ours. So I think unless we see what comes out of the first meeting of the SRs, I think we are probably getting a little too ahead of ourselves.
All right. But you know, Prabhat Chaudhary, even if she didn't say out of the box the way we've been thinking she said it, because it's perhaps been, as Anand points out, misreported, there is something else she said. She said that the Modi visit will be outcome driven.
Yeah.
And she added, on the boundary question, my government is committed to exploring an early settlement. Now, on its own, that commitment is not exceptional. But alongside saying this will be an outcome-driven visit, it suggests once again that there's something happening that possibly we don't know about. Now, are we reading too much into statements? Well, or are they actually hinting without wanting to give away?
Well, let's just say that what I've heard is that when on, for example, on a number of track twos and other meetings between senior Chinese officials and Indian retired diplomats or officials, the Chinese have basically said, we went through regarding Modi, and this is I think the important thing, that we now have two strong leaders in power in our respective countries, and this is an opportunity to solve some outstanding issues that we could not do so before, and one of them happens to be moving forward on the border. And that, I think, is partly what Sasuri is saying when they actually prefer the BJP. There's, in their view, no 1962 legacy issue to BJP, and they also find that the BJP, because it is the right-wing nationalist party, is impervious to being attacked on nationalist issues. That the Congress is always a little wary that they're going to be accused of selling India down the stream. BJP, there's nobody right-wing of them to really attack them on this issue. So she is very much a strong leader, probably arguably the strongest leader China's had since Deng's time. And so now he's looking at the border and he's looking at investment in India, and he's saying that this is a guy who can actually do these. And when you're looking at outcome-driven, Modi is all about outcomes in his foreign policy so far. Everywhere he goes, he says, I have an economic agenda.
So the combination of the two in part at the same time provides an opportunity and therefore a hope that something could happen.
Yes.
Let me put it like this. Something else, Mr. Suri, that the channels have been speculating about and actually rather impressed by is the fact that Sushma Swaraj met Xi Jinping. The channels are saying that in fact it's not normal for Xi Jinping to meet foreign ministers. Normally he doesn't. But if I recall correctly, when Ajit Doval, who's not foreign minister, he's only NSA, went in September, he too met Xi Jinping. So how significant is the meeting with Xi Jinping today?
I'm glad you asked the question, because I would like to start with this whole process. In point of fact, when a visiting foreign minister of a country like India visits Beijing, one of the top, apart from the Prime Minister, one of the top 4 leaders will meet the foreign minister. I mean, depending on the importance of the person or the importance of the situation, yes, the General Secretary of the party and the Chairman, President will meet. So I think the important thing to remember is, ever since the current leadership has come to power in China, they have given a fair amount of importance to the relationship with India. Whether they consider you important or not, that's not the issue. Li Keqiang came to India, Xi Jinping came to India even after the fact that Mr. Modi had just come to power. Mr. Doval was received by Xi Jinping, and Mrs. Swaraj is being received by Xi Jinping. I think the signals they're giving out are very clear, that we attach, for whatever reason, importance to our relations with India at this point in time. I think that's the signal you have to read. And I think when you talk of outcome-driven visits, to go back to the last point, the fact is Mr. Xi Jinping has promised a lot of things. Now we have to see whether that can be converted into reality on the ground or not. And I think that is what Mr. Modi would like to see. But please also remember, Mr. Modi flagged 2 other very critical issues when he spoke at the joint press conference, when Mr. Xi Jinping was here. 3 actually. He talked about LAC clarification, he talked about the water issue, and he talked about the visa issue. So, when you talk of outcome driven, I think we also have to look whether outcomes will be forthcoming on these 3 critical issues also.
Okay, you're absolutely right. Outcome driven doesn't just mean the boundary and the border dispute. But sticking for a moment again to the boundary and the border dispute, Mr. Dasgupta, given that you do have 2 strong leaders, given the fact that they're there together in power at the same time, creates an opportunity to tackle problems that previously were considered hard and difficult to resolve. How easy will a solution be, and how quickly can it be achieved?
I don't think a solution to a complex problem like the border issue will be achieved overnight, even if the outlines of a breakthrough can be discerned or even defined between the two parties. Public opinion will have to be prepared, at least in this country. And that will take some time. I'm not saying that it can't be done within, say a couple of years or something like that. But it's not something which I expect will happen magically during the course of a visit.
All right.
But certainly we can lay the foundations, the groundwork for a permanent solution.
Let's move on. Anand Krishnan, Sushma Swaraj has also said that India is prepared to extend what she calls synergy-based endorsement, but not a blanket endorsement, to China's proposed maritime Silk Route. Did anyone ask her what a synergy-based endorsement amounts to? It sounds like curious language to me, which is a puffed-up way of saying we partially support, but not entirely.
No, I think you're absolutely right. It was the only way that we could put it across, because frankly, China has been very disappointed that India didn't sign on to this maritime Silk Road, and that was one of the big outcomes that they wanted from Xi Jinping's visit to India. Just as Modi is very outcome driven, so is Xi Jinping. So I think for India it would be very difficult to say, well, we're not on board, we're very uneasy with what your maritime Silk Road is going to do in terms of China's presence and influence in Sri Lanka and Maldives and Myanmar. So I think India has to say that, well, we are synergy based. I actually asked Sushma Swaraj, well, we actually signed on to the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. And as far as China is concerned, the AIIB is also one element of the Maritime Silk Road. But she said, well, she didn't actually see the two as being related, and India is a founding member of the bank. So I think India decided that probably we'd support China on this initiative, but probably hedge our bets and stay away from giving a blanket endorsement.
Okay. Now, another issue that undoubtedly would have come up between the two when they met in Beijing would be China's involvement, and perhaps its growing involvement, in Sri Lanka, where India has certainly had concerns about Chinese submarines visiting Sri Lankan ports. In fact, China's role in developing new ports, Hambantota in particular, as well as the wider economic linkages. Now that Sri Lanka has a new government, and in particular Prime Minister Wickremesinghe has announced that he will be reviewing some of China's projects, do you think those concerns have diminished?
Well, I think the game in the Indian Ocean for China it will continue to seek whatever opportunities it can. There are ports that it already has the right of call to, and a lot of these small countries like Sri Lanka, even places like Seychelles, try to play a China card with India. They deliberately try to say, oh look, the Chinese are going to come if you don't give us money to develop the port. And sometimes we recognize this, sometimes we don't. But I think the larger issue really, when it comes to the maritime Silk Route as a whole, which is where I think the synergy term comes in, is that there are, if you look at the entire maritime Silk Route plan, there are elements of this which obviously India will not be happy with because they will effectively mean large-scale Chinese naval presence or intrusions in the Indian Ocean on a scale we'd be uncomfortable with. But there are other elements of it which make perfect sense. I mean, they are just building infrastructure in Southeast Asia and so on that would be acceptable, or we would benefit as
this is why there's some bits of it we like and some we don't.
Exactly.
Let's come, Mr. Suri, to some of those other areas where you believe the outcome-driven visit could actually see some outcome. Visas in particular, it's the sort of issue that rankles with the Indian media each time it crops up. Do you believe the Chinese will actually accept that they have to give a simple stamped visa to everyone and not this special category for those from Arunachal?
It's difficult, it's difficult to answer that question at this point in time. There are many pieces on the table, chess pieces on the table. It's a question of how these pieces are moved in the coming weeks and months. They could make that concession. I doubt if they will in the near future. But if there's enough of a package on offer, they might consider doing it.
What would we have to offer instead?
They see, for instance, a lot of restrictions on their so-called investments in India. They see, for instance, that their companies are discriminated against. I don't think this is actually true at all, because in terms of...
Not even in electronics, not even in telephone engineering?
The Chinese have as many restrictions as we do, probably more than us. In fact, the biggest problem the Chinese are having with Western companies now is that they...
So the restrictions are a tit for tat?
Yeah, no, I'm just suggesting. I don't know, because you see, I must tell you very clearly and to your listeners, See, for the Chinese, the territorial issue is very fundamental. They don't like to make concessions on that. Now the way out of this is actually very simple. When you apply for a visa, you don't have to say you were born in Arunachal Pradesh or you are from Arunachal Pradesh.
In other words, suppress that.
You don't have to suppress that. I mean,
Just don't reveal it.
Your passport doesn't have to have a section which says where were you born.
Okay. Let me come to another possible area of outcome-driven results, Mr. Dasgupta. When Xi Jinping visited India in September, he promised and committed his country to 20 billion worth of investment. Now, this time, according to the Business Standard, Sushma Swaraj has said India will take steps to make it easier for China to do business in India, although she didn't quite spell out what she had in mind. Do you see that 20 billion worth of investment happening soon and quickly?
Firstly, I wouldn't describe Xi Jinping's remarks in India as a commitment to invest $20 billion. That was a target, an aim that he was indicating. Whether or not it materializes will depend on the existing conditions in India. Above all, on whether the government is able to persuade Indian businessmen to increase their investments in India. For the past couple of years, there's been relatively little investment from our own people in India. But I see real prospects in areas such as the railways, where China has high technology now, and in a number of other infrastructure projects. There are certain security sensitivities that we have to keep in mind, but having said that, there's still enormous potential here, and it would make sense for the two countries to explore the full potential of these.
Okay.
And I think a very important first step has been taken in these special economic zones, the two zones that have been set up.
Anand, you're there in Beijing. Do you get a feeling that, in fact, the Chinese government was serious about that 20 billion figure, or was it simply said to flatter and please?
No, I think they're absolutely serious about it. I think there was some confusion when it was announced that they're going to invest 100 billion when the Chinese Consul General said they would. But I think 20 billion is something they've thought out. And one of the outcomes of Sushma Swaraj's visit is that both countries set up this contact group. So the idea is that before Prime Minister Modi comes here in May, that they're going to work towards fulfilling at least some of that $20 billion. Okay. I think a lot of that is going to come from fleshing out what these two industrial parks are going to be about.
Very, very quickly, the other issue on the trade front is, in fact, the very large and sometimes growing trade deficit, which is adverse to us. Yeah. Are the Chinese going to take steps to make it easier for Indian companies to sell in China, particularly pharmaceuticals, particularly IT?
One would like to think that, but I have my doubts, because if anything, China is actually closing the door even to Western companies right now and is becoming much more nationalistic in its economic policies. They were much more open in the past than they are now. They seem to be moving in the other direction. So I seriously doubt that they're prepared to give us concessions that they've never given us before at this point.
Very interesting. There are loads of outcomes that could happen, but for each of those outcomes that could happen, there's a serious question mark about whether it will or whether it can happen quickly, which suggests that sometimes the media can get trapped by the hype and excitement of a visit to believe that things are changing a lot faster than they actually are. It was wonderful to have both of you with us, as well as my two guests from their respective homes and from Beijing, simply to clarify that first reactions can often be the wrong ones. Think about it carefully. The outcome is often different to what you believe. My thanks for you who've been watching. Goodbye.